It's great to see so many dedicated professionals and change makers coming together to engage in this critical dialogue. My name is Muskaan, and I'll be your host for this event. It's an honor to have all of us together over here. We're here today because we all share a common goal, creating lasting positive change in our communities and across the globe. But before we begin, let's start by exploring a question today. Can we truly fulfill our mission to create social change if our organizations do not fully reflect the diversity of the communities that we are aiming to serve? Now, the reality over here is that while the social sector has always been a powerful force for change, there are still major gaps when it comes to fully embracing diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is not just about increasing representation, it's about dismantling systemic inequities that hinder progress and limit the potential of the very people and communities that we aim to support. DEI is not a box to be checked. It's not an isolated initiative or something that lives only within the HR departments. Rather, it's a fundamental principle that must be woven into the fabric of our organizations. From the way we make decisions to the way we deliver services and engage with our communities. Without DEI, we risk excluding the voices of those most affected by social issues. We risk perpetuating inequities that we are working so hard to address. We risk leaving behind the people whose insights, experiences, and talents are essential to creating sustainable transformative solutions. On the flip side, embracing DEI offers us the opportunity to truly innovate. It allows us to better understand and meet the needs of diverse communities. It brings a sort of richness of perspective that leads to more creative problem solving. And ultimately, of course, it amplifies the impact of our work, making us more effective in achieving our missions. So today, we're going to dive into some of these pressing issues by exploring the current state of DEI in the social sector, what progress has been made, and where the gaps remain. We'll hear from social sector leaders who have successfully integrated DEI into their organizations, share best practices and real-world examples. We'll also discuss some practical strategies for embedding DEI into our everyday work, regardless of the size of our organization or the resources available. Most importantly, in today's event, we would be fostering a dialogue. We want to hear your questions, your experiences, and your ideas, because it's through conversation and collaboration that we can truly begin to drive change. At the end of the session, we hope that each of us leaves feeling inspired to act, whether that means reviewing your own organizational policies, starting a DEI initiative, or simply beginning a conversation within your team. Now, DEI is a journey, and while it can feel challenging at times, it's a journey we must all embark on together if we're going to build a more just and equitable world. So with that, without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our key speaker for today, Nandita Krishan. Nandita leads the organizational development and delivery vertical for Arthan, which is a social sector enterprise focusing on effective human capital management by hiring the right people and creating the right culture for superior employee experience. A postgraduate from Symbiosis, Pune, and a certified NLP coach, Nandita is a subject matter expert in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and organization development. She's a train the trainer certified facilitator and often conducts awareness sessions on bias, allyship, and other inclusion strategies for organizations, and facilitates sessions on managerial and leadership development, preparing leaders to lead high-performance teams. She also mentors and guides people in different life stages, helping them achieve their goals and think through difficult situations. She's a global HR influencer podcast author and speaker whose opinions are frequently published in leading publications. She believes in continuous learning and growth for herself and those around her, and is often heard stating, "The grass is always green where you water it." So Nandita, thank you for joining us today. Let's begin by understanding what is DEI? So can you define what diversity, equity, and inclusion mean in the context of the social sector, and how these concepts differ from one another?
Um, to answer your question, Muskan, what I think in my feeling, in the context of the social sector, DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, as we know it, are interrelated yet distinct concepts, which guide organizations in creating environments where all individuals, irrespective of race, caste, gender, disability, they're all respected, empowered, and given fair opportunities. So the concepts are crucial for addressing the systemic inequities which exist and ensuring that organizations not only reflect the communities they serve, but are also actively working to create that environment of well-being for their employees, right? Now, when you look at each of these terms separately, diversity, by definition, means the presence of differences within a given setting. And that's the simplest form that I can put it in. In the context of a workplace, it includes differences in race, differences in ethnicity, gender, age. We have different generations working these days, right? There's sexual orientation, which is not just limited to the binary men and women. There is socioeconomic background, there's a disability status, there's religion. There are so many other identity factors, which we call the intersectionality. So that is how huge diversity has become these days. In this view, diversity is about ensuring that organizations represent the communities as vast as possible, whether in their leadership, whether in their staffing at across the levels, or the populations that they work with. And that is where the social context comes, the populations that we work with. It's about creating a space where various identities, experiences, and perspectives are recognized, right? So while mostly diversity, unfortunately, gets limited to a quantitative concept, where what you just spoke about, it's not a tick mark activity. Unfortunately, diversity remains a tick mark activity, even in the social sector, where we look at how many women are we hiring? How many people from disability status are we hiring, right? What are the different type of disabilities we can hire? So unfortunately, diversity is seen as a quantitative concept, focusing on only representation. But it is also important to note that having diversity alone doesn't necessarily mean that everyone has equal opportunities or is treated fairly. It is about equity and inclusion at this point. Now, when we talk about equity, equity by definition involves ensuring fair treatment, giving equal opportunities, and outcomes for all individuals. So unlike equality, which is synonymous and it is often misunderstood for equity, equity recognizes that different people, that's your diversity, have different needs and challenges, and hence you adjust your resources or support accordingly to ensure fairness. So looking at it from the lens of social sector, equity could be about addressing the historical and structural inequalities which exist that disproportionately affect the underrepresented groups, right? So social sector organizations often aim to redistribute resources, influence policies, advocacy, or design programs that directly address these disparities. But within their own internal organizations, to be able to drive this equity is what diversity and equity is about. And finally, when you look at inclusion, again, if you go by the Cambridge definition or any other dictionary definition in a simpler word, inclusion refers to creating an environment where all individuals feel valued, where you feel valued, I feel valued, Lavanya feels valued, Sapna feels valued. Everybody feels valued, we feel respected, and we are able to fully participate. It's about ensuring that diversity not only means having a seat at the table, but also being able to speak up and voice our opinion and being heard. Heard, recognized, accepted, and maybe not immediately, but eventually implemented, right? In the social sector, when you look at inclusion, it could mean ensuring that marginalized voices are actively involved in decision-making process, in program designs, in leadership decision-making. This often involves power sharing, ensuring that policies, practices, and cultures are welcoming and supportive of all identities. So if I have to give it a holistic look, while diversity is about who is present and equity is about fairness and opportunities, equal opportunity employers, which we like to put on our websites, inclusion is about ensuring that everyone is actively engaged, right? Their perspectives are considered, and they feel a sense of belonging. Inclusion addresses how people experience an organization, if you ask me, regardless of their background, regardless of their gender, regardless of caste, everything. So, in the social sector, focusing solely on diversity without addressing equity and inclusion can often lead to tokenism, which means marginalized groups are present. You have gender on the board, but the gender does not have a right to decision making, or they are not truly empowered. Without equity, diverse individuals may still face systemic barriers. And this is something that we recently did an activity for another organization where the questions, while the senior leadership felt that their one level below was empowered to take decisions and make mistakes, the one level below felt they were not empowered and they felt scared to make mistakes. So it is about holistically involving everybody in the process of DEI. I'm somebody who firmly believes DEI can never be a top-down agenda or a bottom-up agenda. It needs to be met midway. You can't just expect the leadership to drive DEI. You can't just expect the employees to be over empathetic or empathetic and accept, to be sensitized. It is about creating a midway. And that is what I feel in the social sector DEI needs to be. Sorry for the long answer.
No, I think that holistically explains these concepts and breaks it down for everyone to relate to and understand. And since we're talking about these systemic inequities, can you also share some examples of how these systemic inequities manifest within social sector organizations? And just like how you explained this particular instance, uh, does this kind of translate into the decision making and ultimately the outcomes that the social sector organizations are working towards? So, what is your take on this?
I feel systemic inequities are a part of every sector in India. Social sector, the for-profit sector. I think social inequities exist everywhere. But if I have to give this answer in the context of the Indian social sector, unfortunately, we are a country that has very unique social, cultural, and historical context, right? For example, the legacy of the caste discrimination, the patriarchy that exists, the religious divides which we have, and also the regional disparities. And eventually, it is all of these which get into the systemic inequities, if you have to look at it in a way. So, your systemic inequities could be gender inequities. And when I say gender inequities, I'm looking only at the binary lens right now, the men and women. We have a huge history of patriarchy in our country, where women are seen as the primary, where men are seen as the primary bread earner, and the women are seen as the primary caregiver. And even in the workplaces, the roles are somewhere defined accordingly. So women often get underrepresented in leadership positions or in field roles. Role allocations becomes difficult, right? And even in organizations in the sector which focus on women empowerment, it exists, which is the irony of the situation. As a result, the understanding of gender issues becomes narrow, because if you have most men at the leadership position, your programs and interventions may focus on surface level interventions like vocational training, like sensitization. Are you able to understand the deeper issues such as reproductive health, right? Such as gender based violence, such as economic autonomy? If you have a balanced leadership, in terms of gender inequity, most of these can get addressed, right? Um, Another thing is the regional disparity. And this is something I was just talking about some time back before we logged into the webinar with Lavanya also. right, where I was talking to her about how the Indian social sector often reflects the regional disparities, where most of our organizations are working in more developed states like Maharashtra, like Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Kerala. And hence they have better access to funding and resources compared to those in less developed or conflict affected areas like Bihar, like Jharkhand, like the northeastern state stretch, right? So as a result, these regional inequities can lead to uneven development across the country. We have a skewed representation in most of the country. It's not a holistic representation of the social sector when we talk about. Then there are also religious inequities, and if you look at it overall, Muskan, systemic inequities in the Indian social sector manifest through caste, they manifest through gender, they manifest through religion, regional, through religious, funding, and many more disparities. These inequities shape decision making, program design, and hence the overall ripple effect gets impacted, right? Why is funding a challenge for a grassroots level organization and not a challenge for a larger organization? If you view it from the funding, if you view it from the sustainable goal, if you view it from the regional disparity inequity which exists, right? It should not be, ideally. So these are some of the systemic inequities which exist, and unfortunately, it is because of the historical landscape of our country. We can't really do much about it unless and until we are conscious about it, and which is what helps us create a ripple effect in that sector. That's what we are here for, to create more impact numbers.
Very well stated, Nanta. The way you've shed light on these systemic inequities, I believe it makes it very clear that it's important to understand these challenges in order to drive real change, right? And to bring this into action, it's also important to understand what could be the possible underlying reasons for this for these inequities to exist. I mean, what are some common challenges or barriers within social sector organizations in terms of trying to implement DEI initiatives? So
yeah, so I think I quite sum it up again, Muskan, saying there are historical and cultural legacies. There's regional gap. Leadership and representation gap. Not regional. Of course, regional is also there. There are funding inequities. There is an unconscious bias and stereotype which also exists in the social sector. And more often, the biggest thing is the resistance to change that exists, right? It's one of the biggest, I think, myth in the sector that by virtue of being a sector which wants to drive impact and change, we are fair automatically as organizations. We are inclusive automatically as organizations. It's a myth. We are not. We need to drive that inclusion. And while these are some of the points which come to top of my mind, I would love to invite someone to talk more about this, someone who has been driving DEI in her organization with a passion that is honestly infectious for me. It is a pleasure for me to introduce our guest speaker for today, Lavanya Garg. Lavanya serves as the Director for Partnerships and People Operations of at Good Business Lab, which is a not-for-profit organization that proves the business case for worker well-being in low-income settings. It's amazing to see how Lavanya was one of the first employees of GBL, and she has driven its growth to over 120 global employees. One of the few women leaders I know who has made her mark by being at a senior leadership position and provide strategic direction for GBL's operations, development, and international expansion as well, while leading the internal transformations. She also shapes the organizational policies and cultures as the head of people operations and builds key partnerships. Previously, Lavanya has co-founded two organizations. There is ASMAT, which is a grassroots not-for-profit, which is focused for rural India. And then there is SUS, which is India's first sustainable fashion community. She holds a degree in economics from Lady Shri Ram College and Yale University. And as a strategic leader and operational expert, Lavanya loves turning ideas into concrete outcomes. I have worked with her closely myself on one of the assignments we did for them. And trust me, as a as somebody who comes with coupled with the experience of both a founder and an early employee to a leadership position, her leadership style is rooted in kindness, in trust, in authenticity, and she creates inclusive environments where people and organizations thrive. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Lavanya, on this chat, on this conversation that we're trying to drive here.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for having this important conversation.
Thanks, Lavanya. So my to carry on with what I and Muskaan were just conversing about, my first question to you is, how has GBL integrated DEI into their work? I know you've been driving DEI at your organization with a lot of passion. What have been some of the measurable impacts or outcomes of this? If you can share those with us, please.
Yeah, for sure. And you gave an overview of GBL, but I'd like to go a bit deeper so people can contextualize why DEI and employee well-being is so important to us internally. So GBL is a not-for-profit, and we essentially work with the private sector. We work with businesses that employ low-income, blue-collar workers, and we advocate for investments in worker well-being. We advocate for creating better workplaces. So, for example, we've done a lot of work in the garment and textiles industry in India. We're currently doing a massive project in the automotive sector where we're working with around 10 firms such as Tata Autocom, Mahindra, to bring in more women into the workforce and look at what are the challenges that these traditionally male dominated spaces face when attracting more women. And then, as you already pointed out, Nandita, it's not just about getting more women into the workforce. How do these women grow and thrive in that work environment? And we work on a variety of gender topics, including sexual and reproductive health, which you also brought up, soft skills training, looking at worker communication systems in factory floors, so blue collar workers feel empowered to communicate their grievances and issues. And the reason I'm sharing this is because we are working with businesses so that they care more about their workers. Since day one, it's been very important for us to make sure that we care about our employees. We need to walk the talk. So employee well-being has been a critical factor for us since we started. And employee well-being intersects quite heavily with diversity, equity, and inclusion as well. And another aspect of our approach to situate some of the examples I'm going to share is design thinking and using a research mindset, because we essentially do research for the businesses we work with in terms of co-creating solutions, testing the impact of solutions. So our approach to DEI and employee well-being has always been employee driven. We interview our employees, we do focus group discussions, we ask questions, we're always curious, we map the employee life cycle journey. So these are research methodologies we've brought into our policy design, and that's also what's helped us adapt our policies and make sure our policies are relevant as we scale, because what works for a 10 people company will not work for a 100 people company. So these are two driving factors at a high level. And if I had to break it down, I would briefly want to talk about values, operating principles, and then systems we have in place to enable those values and live those operating principles. So values are essentially oftentimes they can remain just words on a piece of paper that are important to you, right? You can say we value collaboration, we value kindness, we value DEI. Of course, it's very important to state what your organizational values are. That's the first step. And even to define our organizational values, and these have evolved over a period of time, they've not been static. We've always gone to our employees and asked, what do you think GBL's current values are? And what are values that we should be aspiring to, that we're not aspiring to? So, for example, DEI is a core value at GBL. Now, it's important to go beyond the value and say, okay, how does that value show up in operating principles, which are essentially day-to-day behaviors? How do you display those values? So, for example, when it comes to DEI, it can be something as simple as who is speaking more in meetings. You said, right, if people are at the table, then who gets a chance to speak at the table? So, who is always taking notes? who is doing the invisible work. Often that invisible work is feminized as well, right? You often notice women end up being note takers, women end up
Yeah.
doing a lot of admin work, who gets cut off in meetings, who gets credit for ideas. And then it goes on to systems and structures, such as when it comes to hiring, how are you attracting diverse candidates? So something we have recently started looking at is how do we reach out to tier 2 colleges? How do we reach out to non-elite universities? Because that's your talent pipeline. And then how are you assessing candidates? Are you looking at just a well-stacked CV, or often what people call a white check? Or are you looking at skills that are required for that role? So for example, we try to ask skill-based questions. If you're applying for a marketing role, then prepare a deck on your proudest piece of work and present it to us so we can assess your communication skills. When it comes to assessing management styles, we do case studies during interviews. So for example, if I'm interviewing you for a manager role, I'll do a role play and say, hey, someone in your team comes to you with this problem. Talk to me like I'm that someone. And that's how I assess your empathy, how you would or would not be a good people manager. And the last structure I want to talk about is comprehensive review systems, where we have incorporated 360 feedback. So it's not just the manager's perception of what an employee is doing well or not doing well. It's also their peers, their direct reports, who are giving a perspective into what they are doing well and what they can improve, to offset biases. And we all have biases. There's nothing to be ashamed of. There are unconscious biases that even I'm not aware of, I may have, right? So to offset that, you get a 360 overview, and we do this twice a year for each employee. And we also have something called a skills matrix, where we have defined GBL competencies, department-wise competencies. So for example, strategy is an important competency, but how you display strategic thinking varies from an entry level to a senior level. So we have bullet points on what strategic thinking means, and employees are graded on this. And that's how promotion decisions are also made. Having said that, these decisions are being made by humans. Again, we know there will be some or the other bias, but the purpose of having this system is that we offset that bias as much as possible. And we always ask our team members that if the system is doing a disservice to you, come and talk to us. Tell us how we can improve. So those are some systemic examples that I also wanted to highlight.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lavanya, for sharing that. In fact, when you were talking about the Leadership Council and how a lot of women representation often is taken as only having a seat at the table, that reminded me there's something known as a concept of the rotating leadership role, which is used in the EI concept, right? Where you rotate the leadership roles, and hence everybody gets a say in the decision making at some point eventually.
Yeah. We
Which
do
brings
that,
me.
we do that in
Oh,
our leadership, where we rotate note-taking role. So
oh,
every
excellent.
a different person who's doing that. So it doesn't just fall on one person.
Yes, absolutely. And I think these are some of the practical actionables uh which can drive DEI, and that is what actually brings me to my next question to you. What are some of the practical steps that organizations can take to embed DEI into their day-to-day operations, like what you just shared? Any more insights that you have from your organization that you can probably share with us?
Yeah, for sure. I can talk about it across a few different parameters,
Sure.
and also sharing how we have worked on these, or even what has not worked for us across some of these parameters. So the first is awareness, and this is something we focused a lot on at GBL, which is just sensitization, introducing a certain terminology, right? Whether it's pronouns, why is using pronouns important? What does that mean? What are caste barriers that people face? What is neurodiversity, right? We throw around these terms assuming that everybody knows what they mean, and that's unfair. Everybody doesn't come from the same level of knowledge. I still read up so much about this. So for example, we had Action for Autism come in and talk to the team about, okay, these are the different types of neurodiversity. This is how you can be accommodating towards your neurodiverse colleagues. So awareness is one. Second is having a baseline understanding of where you are. So every year we do surveys to understand our team composition across social location, sexuality, region. And this is not a mandatory survey. Of course, Everyone may not be comfortable sharing this. We ensure data confidentiality, very select 1 or 2 people from our people operations team have access to the raw data. So we at least have a sense of, okay, this is where we are, this is where we seem to be doing well, this is where we are lagging, and then based on that, we can set our goals. The third is, as you said, DEI is not just limited to the HR team. Muskaan said that initially. And I mentioned earlier that we take into account our employee inputs very seriously. So we have something called a DEI task force at GBL, which has representation from different team members. And a lot of times we share policies with them before they are released to the wider team to understand what we can improve. Even for the survey that I was talking about earlier, this year, we shared the survey with the task force saying, do you think we shouldn't ask something? Or do you think we should ask something that we are not asking? And the kind of inputs we got were fantastic. Our team hadn't thought of those. And then apart from, I would say there are the softer aspects that I spoke about, awareness, and then targets, the quantitative aspects are also important. So once we know from a survey that, okay, we are lacking when it comes to caste diversity, then setting some targets, having targeted hiring. So for example, we have affirmative action in our internship programs. We have a summer internship and winter internship where 50% of the internship positions are reserved for people from marginalized caste backgrounds. And so far, since winter 2021, we've hired 60 plus interns through this program, and some have even gone on to be converted to full-time employees. Now, something that has not been working here, and I'll be honest, and something that we're reflecting on, is that we've seen the rate of conversion from intern to full-time positions has been lesser for folks from the affirmative action pool than the general pool. So that potentially highlights a gap on mentorship or further guidance that could be required, and that's something that we are working on. Lastly, while there are these DEI focused efforts, DEI is cross-cutting. You have to apply that lens to all your policies. So another example I'll give is that our POSH policy is gender neutral. So while the law requires us to have a prevention of sexual harassment policy and an internal complaints committee for women, we've made it open to anyone of any gender to report using the IC, and the same process applies to them. We've done the same for maternity leave. So the law requires us to have 26 weeks of maternity leave. We've made it 26 weeks for any primary caregiver of any gender. So what this means is that we're including non-heterosexual couples as well. And we're not perpetuating, you mentioned social systems, patriarchy. We're not perpetuating that norm that only a woman is the primary caregiver, right? And then lastly, where we bring in the employee focused aspect is, say, while we have flexible work hours, if someone is coming back from maternity leave, we'll sit with them and talk to them. What do you need? What else can we do to support you? And to the extent possible, we try to personalize our efforts as well.
Excellent. These are amazing, I think, practical guidelines that you've shared. And I think they're very implementable also. It's just a mindset shift which is essentially needed. And when you were talking about the changes that you've been making in the policies, Lavanya, at GBL, a lot of buy-in for the policies comes from the leadership team. Most of the policy, while the policies might be prepared by in coordination with the leadership team, until unless there's a leadership buy-in, it does not usually get rolled out and implemented, right? You lead the partnerships and people operations at Good Business Labs. As a leader yourself, what role do you think an organization's leadership plays in driving DEI efforts? I know I mentioned a while back that DEI can not just be a top-down agenda or a bottom-up agenda, but in your thought, what are the most effective ways for leaderships, if we have to talk about, to lead to change for DEI?
Yeah, and I agree with you that it has to be both, right? It has to be employee driven, where you're making sure you're having voices heard across levels, because I won't know the challenges of a research associate who's going out on field work, because that's not my role. And then you need leadership to push for this. And I feel there's a lot to do on leading by example. Everyday actions as well, right? People notice the smallest of actions. If as a leader you don't take your work-life blend seriously, then even if your value says, oh, we don't want people to overwork, But if your leader themselves is not taking care of their health, then the team will think that that is just on paper. This is what I'm actually expected to do to grow to that level. As a leader, are you noticing invisible work? Are you giving credit for ideas? So these are day-to-day actions where leaders can lead by example, and that's what trickles down to the rest of the team as well. In fact, we spoke about this at the EquiLead conference, that leadership is not just about that title, right? Leadership is a word. So if you're in a position where you're heading a department, by doing these daily actions in alignment with your company values, you can empower others to be leaders in their actions as well. Uh, and also, how do you model vulnerability? As I said, we all have biases. Now, suddenly, if as a leader, I go and say that, oh, DEI is important, and now you can't say anything wrong. And if you say anything wrong in a meeting, you will be penalized for it. And I love this term called brave spaces, which is you have safe spaces, not just to voice concerns, but safety to make mistakes,
Right.
safety to disagree. So how, as a leader, are you fostering those spaces?
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that, Lavanya. In fact, something that I always believe in, and in some of my workshops, I've brought it up on conflict resolution, saying disagreements are the healthiest way to brainstorm. It is okay to disagree as long as you're being respectful and you're not crossing that line of empathy or value for the other person's experience that they bring. So I think what you just mentioned also brought that point to my mind. As my last question to you, Lavanya, what if you could envision one major shift in how the social sector approaches DEI over the next 3 years? You've been around in the sector for such a long time. So if you could envision one major shift, what would that be? What would it look like?
You touched upon this briefly on the funding aspect. I do think funding for institutional work, funding for capacity building, because DEI work is not project based, right? It's cross cutting. And if not for profits don't have the funding support to invest in talent to do this work, recognize this work, until this work, in a lot of places, it's voluntary, it's unrecognized. People do it in addition to their jobs because they're not getting paid for it.
Right.
And the reason for that is because there's not enough funding for it. So I feel if in the next few years we can unlock more funding for DEI work, provide that support to teams, that can really be transformational for the sector.
Great. I completely agree, I think. And thank you so much, Lavanya, for sharing these insights. I think I'll just quickly summarize what you just spoke. You spoke about DEI being an employee-driven approach, right? How we need to understand that what do they need in a world which is constantly evolving. For example, making 360 feedback a practice, right? Understand your employee needs. That is something that you touched upon. We also touched upon how GBL is making DEI a core value, and how you're bringing it in your everyday work, and creating more awareness about DEI. We also spoke about some practical steps like annual survey which GBL conducts to touch upon the different employee experiences, I think, and bring out better awareness about that at your leadership level. Uh, the DEI task force, which exists at GBL, which is a great initiative. I think having a self-sustained group like that, which drives passion throughout, really gives a very good holistic and third-party non-judgmental view to it. You also spoke about how you're leading by example, how you're modeling vulnerability, creating a speak up culture within your team and within GBL as an organization. And one more practical step that you shared was how the POSH policy for GBL is a gender neutral POSH policy. Right? So we've explored the importance of embedding DI principles into the very core of our organizations through GBL. The challenges that come up with this work, with the tangible benefits it brings to both the teams and communities we serve as well. One last thing that I want to do is encourage each one of you to take this conversation beyond today. Whether it's starting a new DEI initiative in your organization or even having the thought, oh, maybe I should do this. Don't stop yourself from doing it. like revisit your organization policy, or simply reflect on how your own actions, which is what Lavanya also spoke about, right? Work-life balance. If you don't do it, how do you expect your team members to do it too? So reflect on your own actions as well. And that can also contribute to a more inclusive social sector. I think, if I might use the term, not just organizations, because every step counts.
Thank you so much, Nandita, for so beautifully wrapping up the discussion. I believe we have one question from Rohit, who works at Apni Shala, and he has acknowledged how it's important to uh, work intentionally towards the DEI. And the question that he has posed is, since we're all a non-profit, and I think Lavanya, you'll be better suited to respond to this. Could you share what are some ways you approach to fundraising to make the organization thrive?
Uh, yeah, I agree with Rohit that that's a real problem, and that's what I touched upon in my last answer as well. In my experience at GBL, a lot of the funding has been project based, so it's much harder to get funding for DEI and such work. Um, Also, honestly, there are times when you may adapt your approach to meet a funder's requirements because you also need that funding to sustain your organization. So it's a push and pull. We try to find middle ground somewhere where if a funder is pushing, we also try to share our perspective. I have noticed recently a lot more funders asking about team composition, asking about DEI aspects, not necessarily in a comprehensive way, but at least they do seem to care about representation in leadership team, internal policies, but it really varies from funder to funder. I've also seen some progressive funders have an organizational development team of their own that works with grantees on their OD efforts that also support both in monetary and non-monetary ways. So there's a huge spectrum of funders out there, and I do agree with you, Rohit, that the problem you highlighted is a real problem.
All right, thank you for sharing that response, Lavanya. I think uh, very well stated. Of course, it would benefit to explore partnerships with like-minded funders who are more in tune with the EI principles. And of course, as you mentioned, changing the narrative when we are communicating with the funders would also equally contribute to this. We have another question. Yeah.
I'll just add, I remember at the Earthen conference last year, you all had a funders panel, right, to talk about DI. So we need initiatives like that to change the narrative.
Okay, thank you for bringing this up. Uh, to continue, we have another question from Saurabh, who would like to hear more about how DEI initiative could be made an objective norm, transcending from the subjective understanding of the leadership team. And it would be great if we can focus on the social sector. So, what are your thoughts over here?
Yeah, so as I was mentioning in my first response as well, there are layers to this in terms of if I understand the question correctly, objective norm is more like a value that you state as an organization that DEI is important to us, but it can't be limited to just a piece of paper and just stating that this is important to us. Then you have to ask, okay, how do we show it's important to us? What are the behaviors that we reward? What are the behaviors that we don't reward, where we pull up people? For example, if that you have a core value, are you evaluating employees on that core value in your promotion cycles, right? Because that's a decision that's visible to everyone. And so if you promote someone who doesn't live in alignment with your values, then you're not living by that piece of paper where you've stated your value. So values have to transcend to behaviors, to systems, clearly defined as well. You can't just say to your team that we want you to be collaborative. You have to show that, okay, being collaborative means you loop in XYZ person when you're working on a topic because they have this expertise. If you're facilitating a meeting, make sure everybody gets a chance to share their views. I recently came across this practice, and we recently tried it for one of our leadership meetings as well, called brain writing rather than brainstorming. When you do brainstorming on the spot, it's usually folks who are more extroverted, folks who come with a certain level of confidence, which also ties in with your privilege and other backgrounds of caste, gender. We know, right, imposter syndrome is often more common in people from marginalized backgrounds. So when you're doing brainstorming, it'll be the loudest voices that you'll hear that'll inform the decision. Brain writing is when you get a group of people together and everybody in silence writes, say for 10 minutes. These are our ideas, and then you go around the table sharing. So then it's not just the most quote unquote dominant voices that are able to share their perspective. So there are a lot of ways, small and big, that you can make sure your values go beyond a piece of paper and you actually live by those values. And in all of this, I think what's the most important, and we have a few folks from GBL here today, and if any of them want to share their experience, that would be lovely too. Where we try our best, and again, we're not perfect, by the way. I'm sharing all this today. We also have a long way to go. We are also struggling on some aspects, but we try our best to make sure people can question. That's the most important at the end of the day, right? Because your values evolve, your expected behaviors evolve. So any team member across any level should be able to say, hey, this practice that we have, I don't think it aligns with this value, can we talk about it? And having that openness to then change and adapt is very important.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that, Lavanya. I think a lot of people consider brain writing a real food for thought, as sort of mentioned. We have another question before we wrap up. This question is from Jay Lakshmi, who has done MA in gender studies and has friends from anthropology, sociology, economics, etc. But she's facing a challenge that the resumes are getting rejected because organizations prefer MSW, Masters of Social Working, over these specific specialities. So what should be done over here? How can they focus on the skills and knowledge in the sector?
Yeah, I think Arthan team is better suited to answer this because you all do talent matching, right? So I'm sure you have a macro perspective to this that you can comment on. From a GBL perspective, as I was mentioning earlier, we try to not just be CV focused, because a well-stacked CV is also often a reflection of somebody's privilege and access to networks. So we ask skill-based questions. I gave this example of a marketing role assessment where we ask people to prepare a deck on your proudest piece of work and present it. So we're not looking at their degree necessarily. We're looking at, okay, how are their communication skills? Because for a marketing role, that's important. So we have skill based questions, and then we have a lot of case study and situation based questions, because just asking someone, oh, how do you manage people, is not as informative as giving them a case study saying you are facing this problem with your team members. For example, something we ask, and this is across levels, not just for managers, is you're working with a team member and they are delayed on a certain piece of work. How do you respond? We want people who say, okay, I first ask them what's happening. People who don't say, I'll take it to their manager or I'll just directly, because we believe in giving benefit of the doubt. We believe that we hire people who are highly motivated. So if someone is delayed, there might be a good reason for it. It's important to first check with them. So these are ways where we screen for values. So I see the problem that you're facing, Jay Lakshmi, and Nandita or Arthan team, if you want to add anything from a macro perspective.
No, I think you summed it up very well, Lavanya. I think what also helps, just to add 2 cents to it, Jayalakshmi, would be also to probably look at organizations that you're applying to. When you talk about gender studies, it becomes a very niche and unique place to work in, right? Not all your organizations in the social sector would be working on gender. Yes, it becomes an important part or an overlapping sustainable goal that most organizations in the sector are looking at achieving through their impact numbers. But not every organization is doing gender. So you might also want to look at that.
Great. Thank you so much, Lavanya and Nanta, for your insights. I see that there's another question from Sagar. Sensitizing employees can't happen in 1 or 2 sessions. What is an ideal timeline to deconstruct privilege and reconstruct inclusion?
That's like a lifelong process. So there's no correct answer to what you've asked. I can share what we try to do at GBL. Try to find a balance between having these sessions and overwhelming our employees. So we have a calendar for the year where every month we have planned certain sessions, and these sessions range from DEI sensitization sessions to training and development sessions to well-being sessions. So we have to find a balance between how many sessions are we doing, and making sure we're focusing on each category of these sessions as well. As mentioned, employee well-being is really important to us. So we do sessions on mental health, talking about mental health issues, talking about therapy. So that's a whole different category as well. And we do a lot of repeat sessions because our employee base keeps changing. So, for example, one session we do at least once a year is art of feedback. How do you give feedback? How do you receive feedback? And that's something we do at least once a year. And we see the value in repeating that information because new employees keep joining. We know most people are not going to watch the previous recordings. So yeah, it's a continuous work in progress, is what I'd say.
I think I completely agree to that, Lavanya. And you know, Sagar, any DEI initiative cannot be a one-time activity. It needs to go on. Our unconscious biases also evolve over time. What I'm biased for today, I might not be biased for 3 months later, or 1 year later, or 2 years later. So if our biases also keep evolving, there is no ideal timeline to deconstructing privilege and reconstruct inclusion. It's just a continuous process, like what Lavanya said, right? Rome cannot be built in a day. We just need to keep striving to create it more beautiful. So, and being aware definitely helps.
Great. Thank you so much, Lavanya and Nandita, for your insights. I hope that answers the question, Sagar. We have Kabui, who's stating that they strive for inclusion, participation, and empowerment, which promotes diversity and equity. The underlying understanding remains the same with DEI. So thank you for sharing that, Kabui.
Myself, Jayalakshmi, I have a question. Can I ask you right now?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, ma'am. Last week I applied for the Arunodaya is a kind of NGO working for the people who are intellectually disabled kids. What kind of inclusive idea we can give for them who are intellectually disabled, and those kind of people, how they can save their future, or how can we make a economical source or some kind of backup for them? Is it possible to do anything for them, intellectually disabled sector?
Thank you for your question, Jayalakshmi. Lavanya, Nandita, any insights over here?
I think that's an area we're still learning about, to be honest. So I don't have perfect answers for you. In fact, I'd like to hear from you if you have any suggestions for us. One point that I can share we do in our recruitment process is something called as reasonable accommodation. So we ask applicants if they need any accommodation during the interview process, because we recognize that the typical interview process is not necessarily inclusive for people with disabilities, whether it's physical or intellectual, people with certain access to or lack of access to digital technology. So reasonable accommodation requests could range from asking that we don't do a video call because somebody's internet bandwidth may not allow that, or people can benefit from getting the questions in advance so they get some time to prepare, especially folks who struggle with anxiety. So this is still a work in progress. That's why I said I don't have any perfect answer for you, but we're trying to be more inclusive on this front. And if you have any suggestions for us, I'm open to hearing those as well.
Yes, with this, we have come to the end of today's discussion. as the chat can be, as the chat is stating, it was, of course, a very successful discussion. We touched upon a lot of important ideas over here. A few wonderful strategies shared by Lavanya and Anta, both of you over here. And with this, as we have been discussing, I hope we take this conversation out of this webinar and into our organizations and take an action on it. So thank you so much, Nanta, Lavanya, and everyone else who has joined the webinar today.
Thanks, Lavanya, for sharing all the insights. It was really amazing to hear how we are driving DEI in GBL and creating a thriving workplace. I'm sure we are. Thank you so much for taking our time today and being with us. Thank you, everybody who stayed with us, asked us questions. I think it was amazing to see the type of conversations which were flowing in the chat.
Thank you so much, Arkan team, for organizing this. And we need more time to discuss a lot of the topics that came up in the chat. So if anyone wants to connect separately, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn and we can continue our conversation. Thank you so much.